Online clips of vibrant glow sticks, flamboyant outfits and passionate protesters singing along to K-pop tunes continue to make their rounds on social platforms as foreign media outlets delve into Korea's intriguing protest culture. We have more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome. You're watching Press Perspective for this Friday, December 13th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we explore Korea's protest culture and its creative flair, as well as the impact of the brief imposition of martial law on the country's image. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca with American news agency UPI. Thomas, it's great to have you back.
Thanks, great to be here.
I also have writer Colin Marshall with us. Colin, you're becoming a regular Friday guest. Welcome back.
Glad to be one. Thank you.
Right, Thomas, the festive atmosphere of our public rallies have been making quite a bit of international headlines. I am aware that you are covering these rallies. Do tell us a bit more about these displays of democracy, if you will.
Yeah, alongside the anger and the outrage that have prompted these rallies, there's just been this sense of humor, a sense of fun, kind of music. There's a lot of internet meme type of culture on display. There's K-pop fandom on display. You know, in some ways it feels like sort of message boards on the internet coming to life out in public. You know, one thing you'll see is there's a ton of flags that are being carried around, banners, you know, and some of them are real things like trade unions or political organizations, but a lot of them are just these jokes, these sort of meme things. There's like National Overweight Cat Association or Shrimp Dumpling Union. You know, I was writing some of these down. People who came alone. You know, some of it is a lot of jokes about sort of being dragged out from, you know, like association of lazy people, like people who don't want to come out, who have been dragged away from their computer or their home, you know. So there's this sense of humor about that, and it's just really amusing to wander the crowd and see. I mean, there are tons of them, and it's amazing how quickly they've been producing these things. And there's also, you know, as you mentioned, and you can see on the images, these K-pop, you know, if 2016, the Park Geun-hye impeachment rallies was the candlelight revolution, this is the K-pop, you know, light stick revolution, where there's just, you see tons of these electric light sticks that are used in K-pop fandom. I mean, they're usually branded with an idol or a band, and people are out there waving and brandishing them. I mean, you can see sometimes they're modifying them, sort of stenciling things like, you know, impeachment on them. And there's just been a lot of music playing as well, and some of the soundtrack is K-pop. I mean, I heard Rosé, you know, APT blasting, or the new aespa song, and people are just, I mean, it's like street parties, dancing, singing, a lot of times changing lyrics to, you know, call for impeachment. There was a viral moment where someone was singing like Jose Feliciano, Feliz Navidad, you know, I want to wish you a Merry Christmas song, but changing all the lyrics to criticize Yoon and call for impeachment. And there's some older songs too. Crooked by G-Dragon's been out there. And I think the anthem of this protest, and apparently this has been the anthem for a while, I think since 2016, was this Girls' Generation song. I've heard it a lot, called Into the New World, which is not so much a protest, but it's more like a solidarity anthem. And people are talking about, you know, coming together and getting through a dark time. And it has this sort of, you know, sense of optimism and pushing for the future. So that's been a powerful sort of soundtrack. And I think just the idea is that people I talked to were saying this almost from the beginning. It felt like the protesters know that this is not a one-off thing. And, you know, they kind of feel like they're prepared to keep coming out, and they want to have this spirit of fun or just keep it enjoyable or light. It's not just driven by rage and anger that's going to burn out. You know, a few people I talked to just had that attitude right away, even when the last impeachment failed or didn't come to a vote. You know, I thought people might be angry, but there was no sense of really like storming the National Assembly or giving up. It was just like, we'll be back tomorrow. And I think this spirit embodies that. Right, for sure. They'll be back tomorrow on Saturday, where the second impeachment vote takes place at the National Assembly. Colin, have you had an opportunity to experience this firsthand?
I have. I was over there on Monday, actually, at the protest around the National Assembly station, anyway. And I saw, yes, the vendors out there doing the same sort of entrepreneurialism I saw 8 years ago with the Park Geun-hye protests, where they were selling the glow sticks, even selling food and drink. And I think a lot of the qualities Thomas just mentioned, the evident qualities of these protests, journalists have commented on, the sense of humor, again, the glow sticks, the use of Korean pop music. These all reflect one big difference between these protests and the Park Geun-hye protests in 2016, which is that the average age looks quite a bit younger. I would say about 10 years younger, just judging by what I've seen on the ground and in photos. We've all seen the videos, you know. So it's a lot younger, and the attitude is commensurate with being more youthful. I mean, I saw one journalist, more than one, comment that these are the peers of the students who died on the Seoul, on the sinking of the Seoul 10 years ago, the peers of the young people who died in the Itaewon Halloween stampede a few years ago. So they're part of a cohort that has endured some of the more recent failures in Korea, whether they be failures of policy or otherwise. And they bring that spirit to it. It's not all jokes, of course. And as well, there's not just like buying and selling of glow sticks and food and drink and whatnot. People are also supporting the protests by buying food and drink for them, ordering with apps. You know, everybody's familiar in Korea with how to order food and drink for yourself. Well, they're doing it for the protesters. Like, they'll post on social media, I bought 30 meals at this restaurant, first come, first serve, go get them. Or, 100 Americanos, go get them if you get in line right now, protesters. And that is a very Korean touch, I think, buying Americanos for people protesting. The combination of protest and Americanos strikes me as just quintessentially Korean.
Right, these random gestures of kindness, actually, they've been making headlines as well. And as Colin mentioned, Thomas, there's been quite a presence of young protesters at the rallies this time around. Now, a while back, I believe, here on the show, we did talk about how some people felt that the youth were not as interested in politics as they should be, but this particular reality is proving that they are very much interested. How do you explain this phenomenon of younger generations out there on the streets?
Yeah, I think it's been interesting. I mean, it was surprising to me, and I feel like the general attitude is that it has come as a surprise. There is that sense this younger generation is disengaged, maybe feels disempowered, unplugged from politics. And, it's not just here in a sense. I mean, I think youth around the world sort of feel like their voices are not heard, and, politics is happening somewhere out there above their heads, and they're just trying to get by with their everyday lives and problems. But something really did seem to kind of galvanize younger people for this protest. I mean, it was interesting, the night of the actual martial law declaration, that very first night going to the National Assembly, I remember being struck by, actually, the people that turned up seemed older to me, like middle-aged and above generations who might have remembered martial law, remembered military dictatorship. And I kind of thought that's a little bit more what I expected, but almost by the next day it was filling up with younger people. And yeah, I think there's just something where this has galvanized a lot of the issues that have been troubling youth for a while. What Colin said actually made a lot of sense. There has been these recent tragedies, like the Itaewon Halloween, Seoul, that have just seemed to keep affecting this younger cohort. And so, I think this is a way, expression of a lot of the frustrations and a lot of the dissatisfaction they have with the system, maybe writ large, where they are able to, this is a real tangible thing that they can funnel their energy into. At the same time, it's not like they don't know the history, I think, to some extent. I mean, they all have parents or grandparents who lived through this. And, one young guy I spoke to said that his father, they were watching the initial announcement on TV, and his father was just so struck by the shock and of hearing martial law again, and it just sort of moved the boy to get up and travel. So there's a lot of that energy, and I think also one thing I've noticed that other people have commented as well. I don't know exactly how to quantify it, but there's definitely more women and girls, it seems like, in these crowds, and that maybe reflects in some sense of the mobilization of these K-pop fandoms and things like that. But I think also it reflects there has been some gender divide politically between, younger women, being more on the liberal side and younger men falling more on the conservative side. And I think that was highlighted and maybe played up by the this previous election. And so I think, women have been more sort of outspoken in protesting for some of their rights and issues and feeling perhaps that they're being pushed back against or marginalized. So I think that this was another way for them to sort of express their desire to, be fully represented in this country. And I saw other sort of groups that seem marginalized and feel threatened maybe by this administration. There was several LGBT flags and groups. So I think, this in a way has been a way to channel a lot of different discontent and grievance. And I think, people in general realize how important this moment is just for whatever future they're going to have in this country. So.
Right. Colin, beyond borders, some media outlets point out that the latest challenge to democracy here in South Korea was a very clear indication of the challenges, the threat that democracy faces in the world at the moment. What more can you tell us?
Yes, some news outlets in the West are already celebrating these protests as a victory for democracy in Korea, or celebrating the defense of democracy. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know what's going to happen ultimately as a result of these protests. But the Western media have been ready to praise this push for the preservation of democracy, ready to view Yoon Suk-yeol as his actions regarding martial law as a threat to democracy. And this fits into a context. There is a broader context. Over the past decade or so, there's been much published, much written about the challenge to democracy worldwide, which means something different in the developing and developed worlds. In the developed world, where we are, it's meant generally the rise or the election of authoritarian personalities, shall we say, to the place of a head of state in Europe, or even in the US, or in various parts of the world. And there has been much discussion about why that's happened, discussion about whether this represents whether this reflects a loss of faith in the system of democracy. But I think partially this depends on how you define what democracy is. I think, yes, the imposition of martial law counts as a threat to democracy. But as well, when we had the Park Geun-hye protests in 2016, that was also praised as democracy in action. But I think a lot of us were given a little bit of pause by the way it all happened. While approving of the protesters, perhaps, and disapproving of Park Geun-hye, there was room to perhaps disapprove of the way things went procedurally. Democracy is a set of institutions, and unfortunately, sometimes in Korea, even in Korea in recent decades, how to put it, how things have happened has shown a certain contempt for institutions, the institutions of democracy. So it's not enough that people on the street get angry and the government finds a way to placate them. That is not democracy in a modern sense. And so I think if there is a threat, it doesn't just come from big bad politicians, but it can be destabilized procedurally as well.
Right, and staying with this sobering tone, Thomas, an extensive report by Fox News links the latest events here in the country to the reality of an imperial presidency. For the sake of our viewers unfamiliar with that jargon, could you tell us what that means and what are your thoughts?
Right, so this is an idea that's been around for quite a long time in South Korean politics, which just, means that the Constitution vests a great deal of power in the executive office, in the presidency, more so than in, maybe similar equivalent, democracies around the world. And there's just, power to sort of set the domestic and the foreign agenda, a lot of power of appointments, et cetera. And it's tended to lead to corruption and abuse of power in many, many presidencies. And we've seen impeachment of, Park Geun-hye, her predecessor, Im Young-bak, was imprisoned. It seems that there's several presidencies that have ended shrouded in corruption or investigations, et cetera. So it's tended to have this cycle repeatedly happen, and we're sort of seeing it again. And, in this case, obviously, Yoon very, almost unilaterally and high-handedly declared martial law, as this, almost the most imperial type of thing you could do. At the same time, we did see that the checks against this power do exist and held. I mean, the National Assembly very quickly overturned the decree, and we're seeing, the freedom of people to protest in the media. So it's not, that the president has unlimited power, but there just seems to be something structurally, and it often happens where it becomes a kind of a lame duck situation at the end of each term where the president comes out and uses their power very, strongly in the first part of their administration, the 1 5-year administration, and then towards the end starts to get a lot of, just pushback, investigation, et cetera. So there's something there's something structural, and it seems to come up every time there's a new administration. There's discussions around it. There were discussions when Moon Jae-in took power after the Park Geun-hye impeachment. There was discussions when Yoon took power. I mean, even Yoon moving the president's office from, the Blue House to this newer location was sort of meant to be symbolic of removing the sense of imperiousness. And there's often been these discussions of how to limit the power, maybe introduce 2 4-year terms instead of 1 5-year term, or spread the power of the presidency, share it more with maybe the prime minister, or maybe share more power with regional or local governments. But there's something structural that seems to keep precipitating this. I mean, the article you're mentioning also brings some of this element of the hierarchical or neo-Confucian sort of structures that exist in organizations is contributing to that. And, there's possibly some element to that, but at the same time, there is, a popular will that seems ready to protest and ready to push back. And that kind of abuse of power actually seems to really cause a great deal of outrage here, even more so than I think in some countries. So there's it does seem like a really core conflict within South Korea that has just not been resolved. And if there's anything to come out of this crisis, again, maybe there's an opportunity to address some of these issues going forward.
Right. Well, that abuse of power, the British Daily, The Guardian says that abuse of power by the president showed perhaps the two faces of Korea. Now, this is according to The Guardian. Could you tell us a bit about that particular coverage? And do you share the outlook shared by that article?
Yes, truly Korea is a land of contrasts. That article refers to these two faces, one of them being the one we know now, this exciting, cutting-edge pop culture, whether it be music, whether it be film, television. That's on one side. That's the Korea that's exciting people all around the world. And then the other side is this pre-existing sort of grimly militaristic socio-political culture, which seems to be rearing its head again. And any correspondent here who's been here since the 80s can tell you, back then, that's all they knew about, was the militaristic side, the strict side, the regimented side of Korea. And the side that also inspired protests, that also inspired the democratization protests of the 1980s. And so you do have a neat convergence of these two faces, if you like, in these current protests against President Yoon, because it brings this K-pop sense of mobilization of enthusiasts, mobilization of people who are enthused about something. And right there in the glow sticks, we have this artifact from the world of K-pop that is now representing the enthusiasm protesters have to come out and make their voices heard. But it's certainly a stark framing that there are these two sides of Korea. I don't think it's necessarily wrong, but I actually would say, yes, they're two faces, but they're two faces of one coin. And I think the coexistence of these two sides of Korea, even in the modern day, gives life here a sort of frisson, to use the French term. But yes, it's not wrong, and you will be seeing more coverage like that, I suspect, in the near future.
Right. Then, Thomas, the million-dollar question. Do you suppose this latest political turmoil here in the country is serving to perhaps harm its reputation, or is it showing Korea's resilience in terms of democracy, of course?
I mean, a bit of a cop-out answer, but we can see sides of both, and I think it will take some time to see how this plays out for how maybe it lands ultimately. Clearly, it has had a negative impact initially. I mean, just martial law in 2024 is the last thing that I think South Korea wants to project to the world, and it does cut very much against this image that Korea has created, and the soft power and the sort of cultural power of Korea. And so it surprised a lot of people, obviously, around the world. It surprised allies, which is not a great thing. I think it's alarmed that sense of just kind of, pulling the rug out or surprising important allies is not something that is easily sort of wiped away. Certainly for Yoon, the Yoon administration in general, it's deeply undermined the entire foreign policy push that this administration has made as far as positioning Korea as a global pivotal state and positioning Korea as a bastion of democracy and representing kind of values-based diplomacy. I mean, to turn around and declare martial law really undermines that. We're already seeing some fallout just even among tourism. The mayor was out trying to say that Seoul is safe. I mean, there's sort of fallouts like that. And, at the same time, yes, we're seeing the coverage of the kind of joyousness of these protests and almost the sense of fun and creativity and color and life and dynamism. And that is real as well, I think. And I think the fact that South Korea's institutions did respond so quickly. I mean, this was the shortest lived martial law, I think, ever, and just how quickly maybe we'll see what happens next with the impeachment. But, there was a very quick response to it. And that does show that these are real institutions. I mean, a lot of places are democratic, maybe in name only, but I think here we could see there is, power that is vested separately. So I think that's a positive sign for that. We'll see how this resolves and how that will ultimately maybe say how this is known in history. But I think generally speaking, the more times this happens, you don't want to keep repeating this cycle every 5 or 6 years. I mean, it does create a question of, stability or maybe the maturity of a democracy. So, yeah, I can't, again, to go to the two faces analogy. I mean, certainly we're seeing both sides, and I think, we'll know a little bit better in the future how this is understood.
Right. So while we wait for the politicians to deal with the fallout of this latest turmoil and to better deal with the turmoil, of course, Colin, how should ordinary citizens seek to find a path forward?
Well, I would say to those who are protesting or are on the side of the protesters, think past the victory. Maybe tomorrow the vote will go your way. Maybe it will go against President Yoon. But it just doesn't work so well to only have a negative view, a view of what you don't want. You have to know what you do want. So let's assume Yoon is impeached. If so, what do you want? Let's not just think about what we don't want for Korea, but what is the way forward? Maybe you don't like any of the politicians currently on offer, which nobody's going to object to that view necessarily. So what do you want? What do you want Korea, who do you want to represent Korea? Not just who don't you want to represent Korea? That's what people should be thinking about.
Right, some very great food for thought then. All right, Colin, as always, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
And Thomas, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends this week's editions of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching.